It's sometimes said that democracy dies in darkness. Indeed, that's the slogan of the Washington Post. Admittedly, perhaps one of the most left leaning newspapers, but still a slogan that they feel is important and captures something meaningful. Something meaningful about government transparency and the need for voters to be able to hold the government to account. And how do you hold the government to account? Well, by getting information, or at least information is the starting point. You need to be able to know how the government is making decisions, what decisions the government is making, and you need to be able to dig toward the truth. And that's why you need government transparency. If the government hides who it is talking to, what it is talking about, how it is making decisions, what information is making those decisions based upon, well, then democracy starts to die. And this is why, for example, we've got freedom of information requests. They allow members of the general public, including journalists, to request information from the government so that we can all make a more informed decision. For example, during the voice referendum, a freedom of information request revealed the totality of the Uluru Statement, which wasn't really just one page, as Anthony Albanese had asserted, but rather encompassed a whole panoply of other deliberations, which led up to a 26-page document called the Uluru Statement, which summarised a whole lot of the grievances that many Indigenous Australians had levied against the government, and it also included a push toward a treaty which would involve reparations toward whoever it deemed to be worthy of those reparations. However, now the government is trying to shut down freedom of information requests, seemingly because these FOI requests often backfire on the government and allow us to hold the government to account. This has been coined a truth tax, including by many journalists, who appear to be rather nonplussed about the change to FOIs. And even though those journalists are perhaps fond of Anthony Albanese and perhaps don't really like the Liberals, they know that at some point in time the Liberals will form government and they will won't be able to lodge the FOI requests against the Liberals. And therefore, even journalists see the freedom tax or the truth tax as being a threat to our ability to hold the government to account. Indeed, the government has put forward legislation that would make it significantly more expensive and difficult to lodge freedom of information requests. The government has tried to justify this on grounds that it would help to make the system fairer, more sustainable, and protect the system from AI and pseudonymous attacks. But we can see through this, because you don't need to up application fees, require identification, or slow down the process, or increase government discretion in order to defeat AI. So let's have a look into what the government is actually proposing to do. Well, the proposed changes would be coming through legislation which needs to pass Parliament, which does look to be rather doubtful because the Greens and the Coalition have set the blocker. But nevertheless, the proposed changes are, firstly, an increase in application fees for freedom of information requests. Now, there can be some exceptions. For example, when you're acquiring information on yourself, i.e., if it's information about your own details, then that fee would not be applicable. But for everything else, such as getting information about how the government made the decision, for example, the types of things journalists often do, the fee would now be higher, which clearly imposes a tax on actually getting information. It clearly is an impediment to being able to do so, whether it's a private individual who perhaps would need to raise the money themselves, or a journalist who is going to want troves of information so they can work out what the government is doing. And this can be incredibly expensive, because when you're doing an FOI request, often you don't just want one document, you want a lot of documents so you can build up a mosaic of what is happening. The application fees are clearly an attempt to deter freedom of information requests. They won't totally defeat them and stop them, but they will reduce the number of them, which reduces transparency. The next thing is there's now going to be requirements for identification. Rather than being able to lodge a pseudonymous FOI request, you now need to provide your ID and your full name, and you need to be able to provide information about who you are. This, of course, is a problem, because say, for example, you're doing an FOI request because you think the government is acting punitively toward you, or you think you're being treated unfairly. Well, maybe you'd want to lodge that under a pseudonym to avoid further repercussions and further retaliation. You don't want the government to have retribution against you for seeking information about wrongdoing the government is actually doing itself, and therefore the ID requirements make things worse. Now again, This is sometimes asserted to be an attempt to reduce nefarious, pseudonymous attacks, or bot-related attacks, or things along those lines. But let's face it, Google has been able to do this with its little capture things for a long time. You would have thought the government could be able to actually come up with a similar process to prevent bots from lodging FOI requests. Surely they can do so. Surely they could even just hire such a process from Google. Google, after all, does provide the capture things to various other parties, so you would have thought that the government could find a different alternative that didn't compromise people's anonymity. The next thing is the government is slowing down FOIs. The proposal is to increase the time that they would be able to deliberate on these things, going from 30 calendar days to 30 working days. Now, clearly, this is not decisive, it's not going to completely destroy FOIs, but it's when you add that to everything else. It's just another barrier. And the government might say, oh, it's only a couple of days here or there. But every couple of days, when you need to go back to the government continually for more documents, it all adds up. It slows down your ability to hold the government to account. And lo and behold, the election you're trying to get things in front of will have come and gone. It stops your ability to actually hold the government to account in a timely manner. Furthermore, legislation might come up to a vote before you're able to get your FOI request processed. Every additional day adds a barrier. There are also some restrictions on employee identification issues. Now, to some extent, I have some sympathy for this. After all, you don't want government employees who are just doing their job innocently to have retribution levied against them. However, of course, there is a bit of a fine line here, and we do need to be a little bit careful about just redacting all government employee information. After all, if there's a fear that maybe a very biased or political person has found their ways into an administrative job, for example, if they would hypothetically do so into the E-Safety Commissioner's office, you might want to know that. You might want to know who is making significant decisions. So we need a balancing act here, and attempts to remove that type of information perhaps go a little bit too far. The next issue is in relation to cabinet documents. Now, cabinet documents typically would not be part of an FOI request. Typically, cabinet deliberations can't be requested by the general public because those are seen as necessary for the government to be able to freely debate what it is going to bring to Parliament. And you need ministers, or you need cabinet members, or you need just members of Parliament generally within their party to be able to debate what is going on and potentially have a difference of opinion without that leaking out so that you can triangulate on what your position needs to be. However, again, there's a balancing act. For example, there is a difference between an FOI request being for a debate in cabinet versus an FOI request being for documents that might have been part of a cabinet deliberation, but also might have been part of many, many other things. And the fear is that if you just say a document was part of a cabinet deliberation, when in reality its primary purpose was something else, then you end up with a whole lot of documents being suppressed. The bill proposes an amendment that would cause a document to be exempt from an FOI request if, quote, a substantial purpose for its preparation was submission for consideration by the cabinet. Who determines what the substantial purpose is? Well, of course, the government is going to determine that. And this basically means that they can just cast vast swathes of documents as being cabinet deliberations, thereby removing a lot of information and a lot of transparency from the government. The next aspect refers to deliberative processes from the government. In essence, there's a significantly wider category of deliberative processes documents that would now not be able to be subject to an FOI. In essence, any document that would or could reasonably be expected to prejudice the frank or timely discussion of matters or exchange of opinions between participants in a deliberative process of the government for the purposes of consultation or deliberation in the course of, or for the purposes of, these processes, well, that would now not be able to be subject to an FOI. That in essence could be pretty much anything. Let's face it, that could be almost any document that is ever forwarded for the purposes of being able to make a decision, because that would in essence be something that you would be deliberating upon. Then the government just asserts that, oh yeah, well, maybe it could prejudice deliberative processes if you can't have contrary information put toward us. After all, if we fear that contrary information, i.e. things that contradict our position, might be leaked to the populace, then we simply won't order any of that information. So therefore, if there's an FOI request for anything that goes against the government's narrative, well, that's just going to prejudice any deliberation. That's clearly the argument that's going to be run. Furthermore, any document that whose disclosure would, or could reasonably be expected to, prejudice the frank and timely provision of advice to or by an agency or minister, well, that would also not be able to be subject to an FOI request. Similar things here. Say an agency or a minister makes a decision, but there's a whole lot of documents that go against that decision. Well, The minister is just going to say, well, I wouldn't have made my decision in the way I did if I didn't get all of those contrary documents, and therefore releasing the contrary documents to the population, well, that's clearly just going to prejudice my decision making. Clearly, it's so vague and arbitrary that it reduces the amount of information released to the public. And then finally, if the document disclosure would or could reasonably be expected to prejudice the orderly and effective conduct of government decision making, well, then it would also not be able to be subject to an FOI. That is so incredibly vague and nebulous that it captures a lot of information. In essence, the government here is basically saying, let's try to cast as wide a net as possible to exclude so many documents from FOI requests so we can do things without transparency. In essence, they're coming at this from the Victoria government playbook. They're basically just trying to clamp down on people's ability to hold the government to account. But that should not come as a surprise, because every time someone says something that contradicts Anthony Albanese, it just casts it as being misinformation or disinformation. The guy is disingenuous and clearly now doesn't like criticism. The next issue is processing caps, i.e. there's now going to be a processing cap on things that can be done. The bill would apparently insert a new discretion for a government agent or a minister to find that a practical refusal reason would exist for refusing the FOI request, which could be, for example, if the FOI request would take more than 40 hours or a higher number of work hours as prescribed in the regulations. Who determines how many work hours an FOI request would take? The government does. And then how do you stop the government just saying, oh, this thing would take us 40 work hours to be able to solve, and then just saying that about a whole lot of things? And then, how do you do an FOI request to determine whether that 40 hours was actually valid to begin with? You would have thought that that would be an issue. And then the final one that really sticks out is their ability to refuse an FOI request if it's deemed to be vexatious or frivolous, which I think is an interesting one, because who determines this? The government or the agent. And how do you get a review of this? Well, that's going to cost you a lot of time and a lot of money. So basically, if the FOI request would have been for information that might challenge the government's decision-making, they can just deem it to be frivolous or vexatious, because after all, it would be there to attack the government's decision-making. It must be vexatious. Clearly, that again would undermine your ability to lodge FOI requests. Alternatively, it would be likely to have the effect of harassing or intimidating or otherwise causing harm, or a reasonable fear of harm to another person. What is harm? Well, your guess is as good as mine. It could be anything. Or it is, quote, an abuse of process. What is that? Again, your guess is as good as mine, but it appears to be within the government's remit to determine what that is. Basically, the government can arbitrarily determine many reasons for not agreeing to an FOI request. They can just label it as frivolous or vexatious because the government happens to believe that it is nasty toward the government. Or maybe they just deem it to be too time-consuming. Or maybe they would deem it to also be part of a deliberative process, and if you don't have these back and forth, the robust back and forth that might otherwise occur, well, it would prejudice a deliberative process, and therefore you also can't agree to the FOI request. There are so many reasons for the government here to refuse an FOI request that it is truly ridiculous. It's clearly an attempt to undermine transparency. It's blatant, and it's so blatant that even the Greens and the Coalition appear to both be set to vote against this. After all, the Greens, who are never really going to actually form government, do want to be able to lodge FOI requests again to whoever happens to be in government, because that clearly benefits them as well. Even journalists also appear to have realised that this clampdown on FOI requests is terrible for democracy and terrible for transparency. However, here we are, and we shouldn't be surprised, because this is exactly the type of thing that the Anthony Albanese government would like to do. This is just another extension of their smug, supercilious approach to governing Australia. But of course, let me know your thoughts about the truth tax in the comments below. Do you think it's justified, or do you think it is going far too far?